So we will be going into financial policies and procedures next. And going into the importance of understanding financial policies and procedures on the next slide. Financial policies and procedures provide a framework for financial management, clarifying roles and responsibilities, and clarifying the boundaries within which decisions can be made. So this is pretty important, not only for council, but also for any of the tribal managers that are out there. And if we go to the next slide, we'll start with a question. Do we follow current, relevant, and approved financial policies and procedures? So a number of keywords here. Again, current continues to come up as a theme. Do we have current policies and procedures as far as like how long ago they were actually created? Are they relevant to all tribal finance activities? Do we have something that covers the different activities out there? Approved. Are the financial policies and procedures approved properly? And then the final keyword is follow. Do we follow the financial policies and procedures? It doesn't do much good to have them if they're not going to be followed. And if we are going to follow them, we want them to be current and relevant for all the current activities and how things are handled and processed within the department. So when we look at policies and procedures on the next slide, just a little difference in policies versus procedures. Policies are your high-level rules and guidelines. And procedures are the more detailed step-by-step instructions on how to carry out the rule or guide. So there's a little bit of difference in there between the policy and the procedure. Moving on to the next slide. So these are financial policies and procedures that we'll talk about today. Accounting, budget and budget process, grants management, and procurement. So we'll start with accounting. General accounting policies for how financial information will be recorded. So this includes all your revenue, expense, how cash will be handled and recorded, your accounts receivable, your fixed assets, debt, etc. This can also include the accounting information system that is used and what like system access limits there are or what should be in place, any kind of internal controls related to that system that you want to implement, including all of that with your accounting policies is generally a good idea as well. When we're looking at budget and budget process, so these will outline what the process will look like, who gets involved, who is responsible for what, the ideal times for completion, and what is required for approval, and if and how budget modifications can be made. And grants management. So grants management covers the grant from gathering the data to submit an application to receiving the award and spending it down. So when we talk about grants management, we are talking about the entire process of managing those grants. And on the next slide, we actually have some questions of things that you would want to include. This is an area where I've generally seen there's been either a lack of information or there's processes in place, but they're not actually solidified in any kind of policy or procedure. So with your grants management, what approvals are needed to submit a grant application? Who gets the grant budget entered into the accounting system? Who submits financial reports to the awarding agency? Who submits milestone or progress reports to the awarding agency? Who oversees the grant project? Who approves expenditures from the grant? then the final question here, who checks to ensure expenditures are compliant with with uniform guidance? And that's 2 CFR Part 200. Uniform guidance is a fairly lengthy document with requirements that must be followed unless otherwise stated in the awarding document. So it doesn't matter who you talk to in submitting the grant, or what was actually submitted as part of your awarding, your package, your grant application package. What matters is what is on that awarding document that the tribe signs off to agree to that, to accepting that grant. If there were different provisions and things that were requested in the grant application that didn't make it onto the awarding document as being acceptable, then you need to follow the procedures outlined in the uniform guidance. So I've seen that become a sticky area where a grant manager may have thought that they were allowed to use a specific vendor, and that according to the uniform guidance, it required more than just a sole source purchase. Like you had to actually bid it out. And so that can cause problems if you're not aware of what those rules actually are. So for any of your grants management, you definitely want to make sure that they understand what the uniform guidance actually says and then what is in their awarding document. And as we talk about expenditures and purchases, we'll move into the next section here, which is procurement. And procurement versus purchasing. So sometimes these terms are used interchangeably, but they are different. So purchasing policies are a part of the entire procurement process, and that includes any requirements to bid, who needs to approve at what purchase levels, anything like that. Procurement actually covers the broader process of sourcing, acquiring, and managing goods and services. So it basically covers the entire process from when a manager or staff person identifies a need for a purchase to that department actually receiving that purchase. So like everything in between there that can happen. And that, so when we look at procurement, if we go to the next slide, these can include the spending limits, approved vendor lists, guidelines for vendor selection, so your RFP requirements, sole source, etc., contract negotiation, contract compliance, risk management, vendor reviews, and managing supplier relationships. So your procurement covers the entire process, whereas purchasing is a piece of that process. But if you have just a purchasing department, they may cover some of these different areas. But in general, when you think of the procurement process, that is a bigger, a broader scope. So with the procurement, if you have procurement or purchasing making grant purchases, you also want to make sure they are aware of the requirements then in the uniform guidance as well. And that's just to stay in compliance with it. So a couple of updates here on the next slide on uniform guidance. Effective February 2025, all new procurements initiated by tribes can follow their own procurement standards. The procurement policy must apply to general fund and federal funds. So it can't be a procurement policy just for your grants or your federal funds. It's got to apply to both your general fund and your federal funds. So if you haven't taken a look at your procurement policy in a while, you may want to prioritize that. Some financial policy and procedure notes that we have here. Best practice includes a regular review and update of all policies. Include a review of financial policies and procedures after any major tribal finance change. Typically, if you're making changes in your tribal finance department, it's changes that are affecting multiple departments, different areas. And so you definitely want to go back and take a look at your financial policies and procedures and make sure that your change that you have done actually aligns with the policy. And if it don't, then you want to get that updated. Ask the CFO to review policies to ensure tribal finance job descriptions align with any responsibilities outlined in your policies and procedures. So again, if they don't, that is something that can be worked on then to get updated as well. And again, that's your financial policies and procedures are helping to provide the framework for financial management. You want to make sure that your tribal finance job descriptions actually match with whatever the requirements are in the policies and procedures. And a general note, you want your policies to be flexible enough for operations to be efficient, but you don't want to create audit risks or control issues. So excuse me. So what that's kind of talking about is you want them to be flexible enough so you don't want them to be so strict that it's difficult for operations to be efficient. But at the same time, they can't be so broad in general that you're going to create audit risks or control issues. So those are things like controls. Usually you're talking about internal controls and things that are put in place to help mitigate any kind of fraud or waste. So, so you definitely want to make sure that, especially your CFO kind of takes a look at those, make sure they're updated, make sure that they are flexible enough, but you want to make sure that they're not too broad or general as well. So again, here we have a financial policies and procedures reflection. What word or phrase stood out to you in this area? How often are policies and procedures reviewed and updated? Have you had any significant changes in tribal finance in the past year? And were policies reviewed to ensure they align with those changes?